My name is Eleanor Matthews, and if someone had told me 5 years ago that I'd be standing in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan at 76 years old, holding the deed to a fortune worth $63 million, I would have laughed until I cried. But not the kind of laughter that comes from joy, the bitter kind. The kind that comes from a woman who has learned that life's cruelest jokes are the ones it plays on those who believe in loyalty, in commitment, in the simple promise that if you give everything, you'll be valued for it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really began, to a morning in September, 5 years ago, when I woke up in a shelter for displaced women in South Boston, Massachusetts. Yes, a shelter. At 71 years old, after 43 years of marriage, after raising 3 children, after keeping a home that could have been photographed for a magazine, after being the kind of wife who remembered her husband's mother's birthday and ironed his shirts with precision and made sure dinner was on the table at 6:15 every single evening, I woke up on a narrow cot with a scratchy wool blanket, surrounded by women half my age who had their own devastating stories, and I thought, how did I get here? The answer, as it turned out, was simple. I had trusted a man named Vincent Caruso. Vincent, with his thick black hair that went silver at the temples in exactly the distinguished way that made other women at church socials look twice. Vincent, who had owned a successful auto repair chain across Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Vincent, who had told me, on our wedding day in 1978, that I would never have to worry about anything as long as he was alive. And I had believed him. God help me, I had believed every word. We met at a community dance in Providence. I was a widow then, barely 30 years old, trying to raise my infant son Michael after my first husband, Thomas Chen, had died in a construction accident in 1977. Thomas and I had only been married 3 years, but they were good years. We were poor, yes, living in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, but we were building something. He worked double shifts. I worked as a seamstress from home while taking care of our baby. We had plans. We were going to save enough for a down payment on a small house in Cranston. We were going to give Michael a backyard to play in. And then one Tuesday afternoon, Thomas didn't come home. The foreman from the construction site came to my door instead, hat in his hands, and told me there had been an accident with the scaffolding. He died before the ambulance arrived. He was 29 years old. I grieved properly. I wore black for a year. I took care of my son. I worked. I survived. And eventually, my mother-in-law, bless her persistent heart, convinced me to attend that community dance because, as she said, life was for the living, and Thomas would have wanted me to be happy. So I went, and there was Vincent, charming and confident, asking me to dance to some old Frank Sinatra song, and when he smiled at me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Vincent courted me properly. Flowers on Fridays, dinners at nice restaurants where I felt out of place but tried not to show it. He was kind to Michael, patient, playful even. He never made me feel like my son was a burden or an inconvenience. When he proposed 6 months later, he did it at a park where Michael was playing, and he asked my son's permission first before he asked me. How could I not say yes? The marriage was good for many years. Vincent's business grew. We moved from Providence to a beautiful home in Wellesley, a town I had only driven through before, never imagining I would live there. 4 bedrooms, a real dining room, a yard with mature trees. I gave birth to 2 more children, Rebecca in 1980 and Jonathan in 1983. Vincent worked long hours, but he provided well. I managed the home, raised the children, volunteered at their schools, hosted dinners for Vincent's business associates, and played the role I had been raised to play. The supportive wife, the gracious hostess, the woman behind the successful man. But somewhere in the late 2000s, things began to shift, in ways that were subtle at first. Vincent became distant. He started traveling more for business, sometimes for weeks at a time. He became irritable when I asked questions about finances or expressed concern about bills I saw coming in. He told me I didn't understand business, that I should focus on the home and let him handle everything else. And because I had been raised to defer, to trust, to keep the peace, I did exactly that. I remember one evening in particular, it must have been 2007 or 2008, when I found a credit card statement that had been left on Vincent's desk in the Home Office. I wasn't snooping, I was simply putting away some mail, but the numbers caught my eye. Charges at restaurants I'd never heard of, a hotel in Newport, a jewelry purchase from a store we'd never shopped at together. When I asked Vincent about it that evening, as gently as I could, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, almost contemptuous. "Those are business expenses, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat. "Client dinners, a conference, a gift for a client's wife. You wouldn't understand because you don't understand how business works. Maybe if you had ever worked a real job, you'd know that sometimes you have to spend money to make money." The words stung, but I accepted them. I told myself he was stressed. I told myself I was being paranoid. I went back to managing the household and pretending everything was fine, because that's what I had been taught to do. Keep the peace, don't make waves, be grateful for what you have. The financial collapse came in 2019. Vincent sat me down one evening in our dining room, the same room where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays and anniversaries, and told me we were ruined. The business had been failing for years. He had taken out loans against the house, against his equipment, against everything we owned. He had made bad investments trying to recover. We were drowning in debt, and there was no way out. Within 6 months, the house was foreclosed. The cars were repossessed. Vincent's business went into bankruptcy. I remember standing in our bedroom, the bedroom I had decorated carefully over the years, watching strangers box up our belongings for the estate sale. My hands were shaking. I kept thinking, this can't be happening. This isn't real. But it was real. The life I had spent 41 years building was being dismantled in a single afternoon, packed into cardboard boxes and sold to the highest bidder. We moved into a small rental apartment in Dorchester. It was a humiliating descent, but I told myself we would rebuild. We had each other. We had our health. We would figure it out. Vincent, however, had different plans. 3 months into living in that apartment, he told me he wanted a divorce. He said he couldn't handle the stress of being around me, that I reminded him of his failures, that he needed a fresh start. I was 70 years old, and my husband of 41 years was telling me I was the problem. I sat at our small kitchen table in that cramped apartment and listened to him explain why he was leaving me, and I felt something inside me go numb. Not angry, not sad, just numb. Like my body had decided that feeling anything at all would be too dangerous. "You'll be fine, Eleanor," he said, not looking at me. "You're resourceful. You'll figure something out." And then he left, just walked out the door with a suitcase, and I sat there alone in that apartment and wondered how a lifetime of devotion had come to this. The divorce process was quick and brutal, because the house and assets had been in Vincent's name alone. A legal structure from the early years of our marriage that I had never questioned. I received almost nothing. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state, but when there are no assets to distribute, equity becomes a meaningless word. The judge awarded me a tiny settlement, barely enough to cover 3 months of rent. Vincent, meanwhile, moved in with a woman named Gina, 48 years old, a former secretary from one of his dealerships. She had an apartment in Cambridge. He seemed perfectly content. I learned about Gina from my daughter Rebecca, who had heard about it from a friend who had seen them together at a restaurant. Rebecca called me, her voice tight with anger and hurt. "Mom," she said, "did you know about this woman?" I told her I didn't. I told her it didn't matter, but of course it mattered. It mattered that Vincent had moved on so quickly, so easily, while I was struggling to figure out how to afford groceries. I stayed in that Dorchester apartment for as long as I could. I stretched every dollar. I ate ramen noodles and canned soup. I wore the same 3 outfits over and over because I couldn't afford to do laundry more than once a week. I avoided mirrors because I couldn't stand to see what I was becoming. A ghost of myself. A woman who had been erased. But my social security was minimal because I had spent most of my working years as a homemaker, and the part-time jobs I had held decades ago didn't amount to much. By September of that year, I couldn't make rent. My daughter Rebecca offered to let me stay with her family in Connecticut, but I could hear the strain in her voice. She had 3 teenagers and a small house. I would have been a burden. So I told her I had other arrangements, and I went to the shelter. The Elizabeth Stone House in South Boston. A safe place for women in crisis. That's what the brochure said. And it was safe, truly. The other women were struggling just like me, and there was a strange comfort in shared suffering. But lying on that cot at night, listening to the sounds of other people's nightmares, and whispered phone calls, and muffled crying, I felt a shame so deep, it was almost physical. This was not how a life like mine was supposed to end. I thought about my mother sometimes, during those nights at the shelter. She had died 15 years earlier, and I was grateful she hadn't lived to see me like this. My mother had been so proud when I married Vincent, so relieved that I had found someone stable after Thomas died. She used to tell her friends at church about my beautiful house in Wellesley, about Vincent's successful business, about how well I had done for myself. What would she think now, seeing me here? There were other women at the shelter who became familiar faces during my time there. Maria, a woman in her 50s, who had fled an abusive marriage with nothing but the clothes on her back. Jasmine, barely 23, trying to escape a situation I didn't fully understand, but recognized as dangerous. And Louise, who was 74, just a year older than me, who had been evicted from her apartment after her landlord sold the building and she couldn't find anything else she could afford on her fixed income. Louise and I would sometimes sit together in the common area in the evenings, not talking much, just being present with each other. There was a comfort in that, in being with someone who understood without needing explanations. She told me once that she had never imagined her life would end up like this. She had worked as a teacher for 35 years. She had done everything right. And here she was. That's the thing they don't tell you, she said one night, her voice quiet. You can do everything right and still end up with nothing. The system isn't built for women like us. We're supposed to be taken care of by husbands or families, and when that doesn't work out, we just fall. She was right, of course. I had fallen. And I was still falling, or so I thought, until that Thursday morning in October, when everything changed. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. It was on a Thursday morning, October 3rd, that my life changed again. I was sitting in the common area of the shelter, drinking weak coffee from a styrofoam cup, and staring at a television that was showing some morning talk show I wasn't really watching. A woman approached me. She was young, maybe 35, dressed in a sharp grey suit that looked expensive even to my untrained eye. She had a leather portfolio under her arm and an expression that was both professional and slightly nervous. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Eleanor Chen?" That was my first married name, the one I had carried during my years with Thomas. I hadn't used it in over 40 years. I looked up at her, confused. "Yes," I said slowly. "That was my name. A long time ago." She sat down across from me without asking, which should have annoyed me, but somehow didn't. Her name was Rachel Portman, and she was an estate attorney from Chicago. She had been searching for me for 8 months. The next words out of her mouth made the world tilt sideways. My first husband, Thomas Chen, had not died in 1977. I stared at her. The coffee cup in my hand went still. "I'm sorry," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. Rachel opened her portfolio and took out a photograph. She slid it across the table. It showed a man in his 70s, standing in front of a modern building, with glass walls and steel frames. He was heavier than I remembered, his hair completely white, wearing glasses I'd never seen him in, but the face was unmistakable. The same strong jawline, the same deep-set eyes, the same slightly crooked smile. Thomas. My hands started shaking. I set the coffee cup down carefully, because I was afraid I would drop it.
This isn't possible, I whispered.
He died. I was told he died. He didn't die in the construction accident, Rachel said gently. He was severely injured. Critical condition, but he survived. There was confusion at the hospital, a mix-up with records and identification. By the time it was straightened out, Thomas had already been transferred to a rehabilitation facility in New York. And when he was finally coherent enough to understand what had happened, he was told that you had been informed of his death, that there had been a funeral, that you had moved on. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Thomas was alive, had been alive, for 43 years while I thought he was dead. While I grieved him, while I remarried, while I built an entire life believing he was gone. Rachel continued, her voice steady and professional. But I could see sympathy in her eyes. Thomas tried to find you. He hired investigators. But you had remarried and changed your name. You had moved, the trail went cold. Eventually he stopped searching. He rebuilt his life in Chicago. He went into real estate development. Over 4 decades, he built a company worth hundreds of millions. He never remarried. He never had other children. And when he died this past February of cardiac arrest, he left a will that named you, Eleanor Chen, as his primary beneficiary. The shelter common room felt like it was spinning. Other women were moving around us, talking, laughing, living their lives. But I was frozen in that chair, holding a photograph of a man I had mourned for 43 years, a man who had been alive this entire time, a man who had remembered me, who had never remarried, who had left me everything. How much, I finally managed to ask. The question felt crass, inappropriate, but I needed to know. I needed to understand the full scope of what Rachel was telling me. Rachel looked at me with something like sympathy. $63 million, she said. But there are conditions. The number was so large, it didn't feel real. 63 million. I couldn't even conceptualize that amount of money. I had been worrying about how to afford a $3 meal at the shelter cafeteria, and this woman was telling me I had inherited $63 million from a man I thought had died in 1977. I won't lie to you and say the money didn't matter. It mattered enormously. I was 71 years old, living in a shelter, with nothing to my name but a garbage bag full of clothes and a small box of photographs I had managed to keep through the divorce. $63 million was not just money. It was survival. It was dignity. It was the difference between dying in a place like this and dying with some measure of peace. But the conditions, those mattered too, because nothing in life I had learned came without strings. First, I had to prove my identity as Thomas Chen's lawful wife at the time of his supposed death in 1977. This required producing our marriage certificate, photographs, any documentation that established our relationship. Second, I had to participate in a formal probate process in Cook County, Illinois, which would take several months and required me to be physically present for multiple hearings. Third, and this was the complicated part, I had to contend with the existence of Thomas's brother, David Chen, who had been Thomas's business partner for 30 years and who was now claiming that Thomas had been mentally incapacitated in his final years and that the will was invalid. Rachel explained all of this carefully, watching my face for reactions. David Chen is going to fight this, she said. He believes he's entitled to the estate as the closest living relative and business partner. He has resources and he has motivation. This won't be simple. This could take months, possibly over a year. It's going to require you to travel to Chicago, to sit through depositions and hearings, to have your entire life examined by attorneys who are going to try to find any reason to disqualify you. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the cot I had slept on the night before. I thought about Vincent living comfortably with Gina in Cambridge, while I ate donated food. I thought about the way the intake coordinator at the shelter had looked at me with pity when I first arrived, and how I had wanted to tell her I used to live in Wellesley. I used to host dinner parties. I used to be someone. And then I thought about Thomas, about the boy who had worked himself to exhaustion to give me a better life, who had kissed me goodbye that last morning and told me he loved me, and then fallen 4 stories and somehow survived, only to be told I was gone. Whatever it takes, I'll do it. Rachel nodded as if she had expected nothing less. She handed me her business card and a packet of information. The estate will cover all travel expenses, accommodations, and legal fees during the probate process, she said. I'll arrange for a flight to Chicago and temporary housing. You'll need to gather whatever original documents you have from your marriage to Thomas. Do you still have any of those? I did, not many, but some. My son Michael had been storing a box of my personal items in his basement in Worcester, things I had salvaged before the divorce. Among them was a small cedar box that contained my marriage certificate to Thomas, a handful of photographs from our wedding, and a stack of letters he had written me during the months before we were married, when he had been working a job in Hartford, and we had corresponded by mail, like people did in those days. She looked relieved. We'll need all of it, she said. The more documentation we have, the stronger your position. Can you retrieve the box soon? I called Michael that afternoon from the shelter's phone. He was surprised to hear from me. We had spoken only a handful of times since I moved to the shelter. Not because he didn't care, but because I think my situation embarrassed him. Or maybe it frightened him to see how quickly a stable life could fall apart. I told him I needed the box. I didn't tell him why, not yet. He said he would bring it to me the next day. Michael arrived at the shelter on Friday evening. He looked uncomfortable standing in the lobby, a tall man in his mid-40s, wearing a Patriots jacket and holding a cardboard box carefully in both hands, like it might break. He handed it to me without quite meeting my eyes. "Mum," he said quietly, "if you need money or a place to stay, you can ask. You know that, right?" "I know," I told him, "but I'm managing. Thank you for bringing this." He left quickly, and I didn't blame him. No one wants to see their mother in a place like that. No one wants to confront the reality that the safety they've always assumed existed might not actually be there. I took the box back to my cot and opened it for the first time in years. Inside the cedar box, smooth and fragrant even after all this time. I lifted the lid. The marriage certificate was on top. Yellowed but intact. Dated April 22nd, 1974. Thomas and me on our wedding day, standing in front of a courthouse in Providence because we couldn't afford a church ceremony. I was wearing a simple white dress I had sewn myself. He was in a borrowed suit. We looked impossibly young. There were other photos too. Us at a park. Us in our tiny apartment with Thomas holding baby Michael, who couldn't have been more than a few months old. And then the letters, tied with a piece of kitchen twine. I untied them carefully and read the first one. "Dearest Eleanor," it began, "I miss you more than words can properly say. Hartford feels 1,000 miles away, even though I know it's barely 90. I'm working doubles most days, trying to save as much as I can, so when I come home, we can finally start looking for that house you want. I think about you every night before I sleep, about the life we're going to build together, about being a good husband and a good father. I promise you, Eleanor, I will work as hard as I need to work to give you everything you deserve. All my love, Thomas." I sat on that cot and held those letters and let myself cry for the first time since Rachel Portman had shown me that photograph. Not loud crying, just quiet tears that ran down my face and dripped onto the pages. I cried for the boy Thomas had been, for the man I had thought was dead, for the 43 years we had lost. And maybe, just a little, I cried for myself, for the woman who had tried so hard to do everything right and still ended up here. I read through all the letters that night. There were 17 of them, spanning the 3 months Thomas had worked in Hartford before we got married. Each one was full of plans and dreams and the kind of earnest devotion that young people have before life teaches them to be more guarded. The children we would have, the garden I would plant. He wrote about how much he loved me, how lucky he felt to have found me, how he couldn't wait to start our life together. Reading those letters in that shelter, surrounded by the sounds of other women suffering, was almost unbearable. because the life Thomas had written about with such hope had happened, but only for 3 years before it was ripped away. And then we had both spent the next 43 years living separate lives, him thinking I had moved on and forgotten him, me thinking he was dead. What a waste. What a terrible, senseless waste. But there was also something else in those letters, something I needed to see. Proof that I had been loved, really loved, in a way that Vincent had never loved me, for all our 41 years together. Thomas had loved me with a kind of devotion that doesn't calculate, or keep score, or give up when things get hard. And somehow, impossibly, he had kept loving me even after he thought he'd lost me. Enough to never marry anyone else. Enough to leave me everything he had built. That had to mean something. That had to count for something. The flight to Chicago was arranged for the following Tuesday. Rachel had booked me a room at a modest but clean hotel near her office in the Loop. It was the first time I had been on an airplane in almost 15 years. Vincent and I had stopped traveling once the financial troubles began, and before that, our vacations had been limited to driving trips along the East Coast. Sitting in that window seat, watching Boston shrink beneath me, I felt a strange sense of dislocation, as if I was shedding an old skin and didn't yet know what was underneath. The flight attendant offered me a beverage, and I asked for water, just water. I couldn't imagine eating or drinking anything more substantial. My stomach was in knots. I kept thinking about what was waiting for me in Chicago. Legal battles, depositions, David Chen, whoever he was, trying to take away the one thing that might save me from dying in poverty. I looked out the window at the clouds and thought about how strange it was that my entire life could change because of a hospital mix-up 43 years ago. How different everything would have been if someone had just double-checked their records. If Thomas and I had known we were both alive, if we'd had the chance to grow old together, the way we'd planned. Chicago in October was cold and windy, the kind of wind that cuts through your coat and finds every gap. Rachel met me at the hotel and helped me get settled. The room was small but warm, with a real bed and clean sheets, and a window that looked out onto the street below. After months of the shelter, it felt like impossible luxury. There was a private bathroom, a thermostat I could control. I stood in the middle of that room and felt tears prick my eyes again. Not from sadness this time, but from sheer relief at being in a space that was mine, even temporarily. That first night I took a long shower, just because I could, standing under the hot water until my fingers pruned. And then I sat on the bed and called my daughter, Rebecca. I told her everything. About Rachel Portman, about Thomas, about the $63 million, about David Chen and the legal battle ahead. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mom," Rebecca finally said, and her voice was shaking. "Is this real? Is this actually happening? It sounds like something from a movie." I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out a bit strangled. "I know, sweetheart. I know it does. But it's real. I'm in Chicago right now. I have lawyers. There's a probate process. There's someone contesting it. But yes, I think it's real. I think this is actually happening." She started crying. I could hear her trying to muffle it, but I knew my daughter's sounds. I knew every variation of her emotions from a lifetime of being her mother. "Oh, Mom," she said. "Oh, thank God. I've been so worried about you. I wanted you to come stay with us, but I didn't know how to make it work, and I felt so terrible, and I didn't know what to do, and—" "Rebecca," I interrupted gently, "it's all right. You don't need to explain. I understand. You have your own family, your own life. I never expected you to take me in. That's not your responsibility. Just know that if this works out, things are going to be very different. For all of us." We talked for another hour. Rebecca wanted to know everything. What Thomas looked like in the photograph, what the lawyers had said, what David Chen was claiming. I answered as honestly as I could, though I downplayed the fear part, because mothers protect their children, even when the children are grown, even when the mother is the one who needs protecting. After we hung up, I sat on the bed for a long time, just looking around the room. The clean carpet, the fresh towels, the little coffee maker on the desk. These small comforts that most people take for granted. I had been so far down that even this modest hotel room felt like a miracle. and I thought about how easily it can happen. How quickly you can go from comfortable middle-class existence to homelessness. One bad decision, one betrayal, one stroke of bad luck. That's all it takes. The probate process officially began the following week. Rachel introduced me to the lead attorney handling the estate, a man named Lawrence Briggs, who had worked with Thomas for over 20 years. Lawrence was in his 60s, precise and formal, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He had the bearing of someone who had spent his entire career in expensive conference rooms, speaking in measured tones about serious matters. But there was also a kindness in his eyes when he looked at me. Something that suggested he understood this wasn't just a legal case to me, it was my life. Lawrence explained the situation thoroughly. We met in his office, which had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. And he laid out documents across a massive conference table. Thomas's will was clear and legally sound, he told me. It had been drafted 8 years before his death and updated twice, most recently just 14 months before he passed. In it, Thomas explicitly named me, Eleanor Chen, as the primary beneficiary of his entire estate, with the exception of several charitable bequests and a small trust for his brother David's grandchildren. The will was airtight, Lawrence explained. Thomas had used excellent attorneys, had clearly documented his wishes, and had been thoroughly examined by medical professionals who could attest to his mental competency. But David Chen, however, was not accepting this quietly. He had retained his own legal team and filed a formal contest of the will, claiming that Thomas had suffered from diminishing mental capacity in his final years, and that I had somehow exerted undue influence, despite not having seen Thomas in over 4 decades, and not even knowing he was alive. It's a thin argument legally, Lawrence assured me, but thin arguments still require response, and still consume time and money. He expected to inherit everything. He and Thomas built the company together, and David feels entitled to it. He's also, I suspect, embarrassed. His brother left everything to a woman he hadn't seen since the 70s, rather than to him. That's a message, whether Thomas meant it that way or not. What kind of man is David? I asked. Lawrence considered the question carefully. Successful. Driven. Not particularly warm. Thomas was the creative one, the visionary. David was the operations guy, the one who made things run smoothly. They complemented each other well in business, but personally, I don't think they were ever very close. Thomas rarely talked about family. He was very private about his past. The first hearing was scheduled for early November in the Cook County Probate Court. I attended with Rachel and Lawrence, wearing a dress that Rachel had helped me purchase because I owned nothing appropriate for a courtroom. We had gone shopping together 2 days before, and Rachel had been kind about it, never making me feel ashamed that I needed her help choosing something suitable. She understood, I think, that I had been stripped of everything, including the knowledge of how to present myself in situations like this. David Chen sat across the room with his attorneys, 3 of them, all in expensive suits. David himself was in his late 60s, shorter than Thomas had been, with thinning grey hair and sharp eyes that fixed on me with unconcealed hostility the moment I entered. He didn't try to hide it. He stared at me like I was something that had crawled out from under a rock. And I felt my spine straighten in response. I had been looked at with contempt before. Vincent had perfected that look in the final years of our marriage. I knew how to endure it. The judge was a woman named Constance Okafor, calm and methodical, who listened to both sides present their initial arguments with patient attention. David's lead attorney, a man named Harrison Steele, he claimed that Thomas had been isolated in his final years, that he had suffered memory lapses and confusion, that the will reflected not his true wishes, but a romanticized fantasy about a woman from his distant past whom he barely remembered. Steele painted me as an opportunist who had somehow manipulated the situation from afar, a characterization so absurd I almost laughed in that courtroom. Mr. Steele stood there in his expensive suit and told Judge Okafor that I, a woman living in a homeless shelter, had somehow exerted undue influence over a millionaire in Chicago, whom I didn't even know was alive. He suggested that I had been planning this for years, that I had somehow tracked Thomas down and convinced him to change his will. It was insulting and ridiculous, and I could see from Judge Okafor's expression that she found it as absurd as I did. Lawrence Briggs responded with medical records, deposition testimony from Thomas's personal physician, confirming his mental competency throughout the relevant time period, and statements from Thomas's accountant, financial advisor, and attorney, all of whom had interacted with him regularly and could attest to his clarity of mind. He also entered into evidence Thomas's personal journal, something I hadn't known existed until that moment. Thomas had kept journals, apparently for decades. Lawrence read selected passages aloud in that courtroom, passages where Thomas wrote about me by name. One entry from 6 years before his death. I think about Eleanor most days. I wonder if she's happy. I hope she found a good life after I was gone. I still have the photograph of her from our wedding day. We both were. I wonder if she ever thinks of me, or if I'm just a sad memory she put away a long time ago. Another entry from 3 years before his death. I've updated my will again today. Eleanor will receive everything when I'm gone. David won't understand. He'll be angry. But she was my wife. She was the mother of my child, and I left her believing I was dead. I can't undo that, but I can do this. It's the very least I owe her. David has done well for himself. He'll be fine. But Eleanor, if she's still out there, if she's still alive, she deserves this. She deserves everything I can give her. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to Lawrence read those words in his measured attorney voice, I felt something crack open inside my chest. Not grief exactly, but something older and deeper. Regret. Loss. The weight of 43 years that could have been different. I kept my hands folded in my lap, and my expression neutral, because I was being watched. And I had learned over 7 decades that women are always being watched and judged for how they respond to pain. Judge Okafor listened to everything, made notes, and then set a schedule for further hearings and depositions. The process would take months, she explained. Both sides would present evidence, witnesses would be called, and at the end, she would make a determination about the validity of the will and Thomas's testamentary capacity. I thanked Lawrence and Rachel afterward, and went back to my hotel room and sat very still for a long time, thinking about the strange architecture of a life. How one moment, one accident, one bureaucratic mix-up could redirect everything. How Thomas had spent 43 years believing I had moved on and forgotten him, and I had spent 43 years believing he was dead. And both of us had been wrong in ways that could never be corrected. The weeks that followed settled into a routine. I met regularly with Rachel and Lawrence to prepare for depositions and hearings. I reviewed documents, answered questions, and slowly assembled the evidence of my life with Thomas. The process was exhausting and invasive. Every detail of my marriage to Thomas was scrutinized. Every detail of my marriage to Vincent was examined. My finances, my relationships with my children, my mental health, my current living situation. Everything was laid bare for strangers to pick apart and analyze. Rachel was particularly focused on establishing the authenticity of my identity and my relationship with Thomas, which meant bringing in Michael as a witness. My son flew to Chicago in late November, nervous but willing. I hadn't seen him since he'd delivered the box to the shelter, and when he walked into Lawrence's office for the pre-deposition meeting, I almost cried. He looked tired, older than his years, like he'd been carrying a weight he hadn't known how to set down. "Mom," he said, and hugged me tightly. I'm sorry I haven't been there for you more. I'm sorry about everything." "You have nothing to be sorry for," I told him. "You have your own life, your own family. This isn't your burden to carry, but I'm grateful you're here now." Michael gave his deposition the next day, confirming that I had been married to Thomas Chen, that Thomas was his father, and that I had genuinely believed Thomas had died in 1977, and had mourned him accordingly. He spoke about his memories of Thomas, what little he had, since he'd been just an infant when the accident happened. He spoke about growing up, believing his father was dead, about Vincent becoming his stepfather, about the life we'd built in Wellesley. The attorneys asked him about my relationship with Vincent, about the divorce, about my mental state. Michael handled it all with a calm I didn't know he possessed. When they asked if he believed I was capable of manipulating a situation for financial gain, he looked at them like they'd lost their minds. My mother, he said, spent 43 years taking care of other people. She put everyone else first her entire life. The idea that she would manipulate anyone for anything is offensive. She didn't even know Thomas was alive until a few months ago. How could she have manipulated him when she thought he was dead? I was proud of him in that moment. Proud that despite everything that had happened, despite my failure to protect him from seeing his mother end up in a shelter, he was still willing to stand up for me. David Chen's attorneys deposed me in early December. It was an uncomfortable experience, sitting in a conference room while Harrison Steele asked me questions designed to make me look calculating or dishonest. He asked about my second marriage to Vincent. He asked about the divorce. He asked, with a particular insinuating tone, whether I had known Thomas was alive and had been waiting for an opportune moment to claim his estate. I answered every question calmly and truthfully. No, I had not known. Yes, I had been shocked when Rachel found me. No, I had never sought Thomas out because I believed he was dead. I had mourned him, I had raised his son, I had moved on with my life, because that's what you do when someone dies. You grieve, and then you continue living, because you don't have a choice. Steele asked about my current living situation. Where had I been residing when Rachel Portman contacted me? I told him the truth. The Elizabeth Stone House, a shelter for women in crisis in South Boston. There was a brief silence in the room. Steele looked at his notes, then at me, something flickering across his face. You were living in a homeless shelter? He asked. His tone suggesting this was somehow incriminating. Yes, I said. Following my divorce, I had no other options. My ex-husband received virtually everything in the divorce settlement because the assets were in his name. I had minimal social security income and couldn't afford housing. So yes, I lived in a shelter. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's the truth. He made a note of this, and I saw something flicker across his face that might have been discomfort or calculation. He moved on to other questions, asking about my relationship with my children, my mental health history, whether I'd ever been treated for depression or anxiety. I answered honestly, yes, I'd experienced depression after Vincent left me. Who wouldn't? But I'd never been hospitalized, never been deemed mentally incompetent. I was just a woman dealing with a difficult situation as best I could. The deposition lasted 5 hours. By the end, I was exhausted, but I'd held my ground. I hadn't let Steele rattle me, or trick me into saying anything that could be used against me. When it was over, Lawrence told me I'd done well. You were credible, he said, sympathetic, honest. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. As the winter deepened, I began to learn more about the life Thomas had built in Chicago. Lawrence shared details carefully, aware that I might find them painful, but I insisted on knowing. I wanted to understand who Thomas had become in those 43 years, what kind of man he'd been, what kind of life he'd lived without me. Thomas had started in construction again after his rehabilitation, working his way up from laborer to foreman, to eventually starting his own small development company in the early 1980s. He had been smart, Lawrence said, and cautious. He bought properties in neighborhoods that were about to turn, held them, developed them, and sold at the right time. By the 1990s, his company was one of the most respected development firms in the Midwest. He had a good eye, Lawrence told me. He could walk through a neighborhood and see what it could become, not just what it was. And he was honest. In an industry where cutting corners and shady deals are common, Thomas was known for doing things right. He paid his workers well. He used quality materials. He built things that lasted. People respected him for that. But he lived modestly despite his wealth, Lawrence continued. A nice condo in Lincoln Park, but nothing ostentatious. He drove a 10-year-old Volvo. He wore the same brands he'd always worn. He He didn't collect art or cars, or any of the typical rich man things. He donated significant amounts to charities that supported construction workers and their families, trauma recovery programs, and organizations that helped young men from low-income backgrounds get into skilled trades. He was quiet about his philanthropy. Most of the people who knew him had no idea how much money he actually had. "And he never remarried?" I asked, needing to hear it again. Lawrence shook his head. "Never even came close, from what I understand. He dated occasionally over the years. Nothing serious. He told me once years ago, when we were discussing his estate planning, that he had already been married to the only woman who mattered, and it wouldn't be fair to anyone else to pretend otherwise. I thought he was being dramatic at the time, but now I understand he meant you." I didn't know what to do with that information. Part of me wanted to be angry at Thomas for letting me believe he was dead, for not trying harder to find me. But the rational part of me understood that he had tried, and that life is complicated, and that sometimes the bureaucratic machinery of the world just crushes people in its gears without meaning to. And another part of me, the part I barely wanted to acknowledge, felt something almost like tenderness. He had remembered me. He had carried me with him for 43 years. That had to count for something. Lawrence showed me photographs from Thomas's life. Pictures of the buildings he'd developed. Photos of him at construction sites, older and grayer but still with that same focused intensity I remembered from when we were young. There was one photograph in particular that stayed with me. Thomas at maybe 60 years old, standing in front of a newly completed apartment building, arms crossed, slight smile on his face. Behind him, you could see workers packing up their equipment, the job finished. He looked proud, content, but also somehow lonely, even surrounded by people. Did he have friends? I asked Lawrence. Was he happy? Lawrence considered the question. He had colleagues he respected, business associates he worked with regularly, but close friends? I don't think so. He was friendly but private. He'd come to company events, holiday parties, but he'd always leave early. He'd make conversation but never about personal things. I worked with him for 20 years and I never knew about you until I read his will. He kept that part of his life completely closed off. David Chen's hostility, meanwhile, only intensified as the probate process continued. In January, I began noticing a car parked across from my hotel at odd hours. A dark blue sedan with tinted windows. It appeared multiple times over the course of a week, and when I mentioned it to Rachel, her expression darkened immediately. "How many times have you seen it?" she asked. I told her, at least 5 times that I'd noticed. Maybe more that I hadn't. Sometimes late at night, once very early in the morning when I went out for a walk. The same car, always parked where it had a view of the hotel entrance. Rachel contacted hotel security, who reviewed the parking garage footage and confirmed that someone had indeed been surveilling the building. The same sedan had been circling the block, parking at different locations, always positioned where it could observe the hotel entrance. Rachel filed a formal complaint with the court, and Judge Okafor issued a warning to David's legal team about inappropriate conduct. But the surveillance didn't stop immediately. It continued for another week before finally ceasing, and I spent that week feeling watched and vulnerable in a way I hadn't since the worst days of the divorce. I started looking over my shoulder constantly. I changed my routine, left the hotel at different times, took different routes on my walks. I felt like I was being hunted, and I hated it. But the surveillance wasn't the worst of it. In early February, my daughter Rebecca called me, upset in a way she was trying to control, but failing. "Mum," she said, her voice shaking. "Something happened. A man came to my house this afternoon." My stomach dropped. "What man? What happened? Are you okay?" She was fine physically, she assured me, but she was rattled. A well-dressed man had come to her door, polite, professional, saying he was conducting due diligence on behalf of an unnamed estate interest. He had asked Rebecca invasive questions about my mental health, about my drinking habits, about my relationship with Thomas during our marriage. He had implied, without stating directly, that there were concerns about my capacity to manage a large estate responsibly. He asked if you'd ever been violent or erratic, Rebecca said. If you'd ever been treated for mental illness. If you'd had problems with alcohol or drugs. Mom, I didn't know what to say. I was so confused. I answered some of his questions before I realized I shouldn't be talking to him at all. Then I asked him to leave, and he gave me his business card. What was the name? I asked, though I already suspected. Rebecca told me. Derek something. The card said he was a consultant with a private investigations firm. I had her text me a photograph of the card, and then I got off the phone and sat in my hotel room for a few minutes with my hands in my lap, feeling the particular quality of anger that comes not from heat, but from cold, the kind that clarifies rather than inflames. The next morning, I informed Lawrence and Rachel. Lawrence was furious in his quiet, controlled way. He immediately drafted a cease and desist letter to David's attorneys, documenting this contact as potential witness intimidation. Judge Okafor was less patient this time. She called both legal teams into her chambers and, according to Lawrence, made it very clear that any further attempts to contact or intimidate witnesses would result in sanctions and potentially a summary judgment in my favor. David's attorneys backed off after that, at least visibly. But the damage to my peace of mind was done. I felt watched, vulnerable, exposed in a way I hadn't since my worst days at the shelter. I started having trouble sleeping. I would lie awake in my hotel room, listening to the sounds of the city outside, wondering if someone was watching the building, wondering what David would do next, wondering if I was strong enough to see this through. It was during this period that I met someone who would become unexpectedly important to my life in Chicago. Her name was Margaret Poole, and I met her at a small diner near my hotel, where I had started eating breakfast most mornings. The place was called Murphy's, a no-nonsense establishment with vinyl booths and a lunch counter, the kind of place that's been serving the same menu for 40 years and sees no reason to change. Margaret was perhaps 72, a compact woman with iron-grey hair cut in a practical bob and eyes that were both warm and assessing. She sat at the counter every morning between 7 and 8, reading the Tribune and drinking black coffee. We nodded to each other for several weeks before we actually spoke, the way people do when they occupy a shared space regularly without formal introduction. The conversation began over a shared newspaper. The diner only had one copy, and I had reached for it at the same moment Margaret had. We both laughed, and she said, "Take it. I've already finished the crossword anyway." Her voice was warm but direct, with a Chicago accent that spoke of someone who'd lived in the city her entire life. I sat down on the stool next to hers, and we fell into easy conversation about nothing in particular. The weather, which was brutally cold, the city, which I was still learning to navigate, the best items on the diner menu, which Margaret knew comprehensively. "The corned beef hash is decent if you're in the mood for something heavy," she told me. "The eggs are always reliable. Avoid the fish on Fridays, despite what the menu says. This isn't the kind of place that does fish well." Her story, when it emerged over subsequent mornings, was that she had been a labor attorney for 40 years, working primarily with unions and workers' rights organizations. She had retired 5 years ago, and now volunteered with legal aid societies, and spent her time reading, walking her H and Basset hound named Hamilton, and coming to this diner for breakfast because, as she put it, the eggs were decent and the staff didn't rush you out the door. She was sharp, funny, and refreshingly direct. I found myself looking forward to our morning conversations in a way I hadn't anticipated. Margaret didn't make small talk for the sake of filling silence. When she asked how you were, she actually wanted to know. When she told you something, it was because she thought it was worth saying. There was no pretense about her, no social performance. Just honest, straightforward, human connection. I didn't tell Margaret about the probate case at first. It felt too personal, too complicated. I simply enjoyed having a normal conversation with someone who didn't know my situation, who wasn't looking at me with pity or judgment. But eventually, in late February, after a particularly stressful deposition where David's attorneys had implied that I was essentially a gold digger capitalizing on a dead man's sentimentality, I arrived at the diner, visibly upset. Margaret took one look at me, set down her newspaper, and said, "All right, you're going to tell me what's going on, and then we're going to figure out how to handle it. Not a question, a statement, an assumption that of course I would tell her, because that's what friends do. So I told her everything. Thomas, the estate, David's harassment, the surveillance, the investigator showing up at Rebecca's house, the depositions and hearings, and the constant feeling of being picked apart by lawyers who wanted to find any excuse to disqualify me. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing progressively more serious. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said something that shifted my entire perspective. "You need to understand something," she said. "What David Chen is doing isn't just unpleasant, it's desperate. Which means he knows he's losing. People don't harass witnesses and surveil opponents when they're confident in their legal position. They do it when they're trying to intimidate someone into backing down or making a mistake. Your attorneys are handling this correctly, but you need to stay composed. Don't give him anything to use, don't respond to provocation. Just keep showing up and telling the truth." It was advice I needed to hear, and it helped. Margaret, despite not being involved in my case officially, became a sounding board and a source of steady support. We continued meetings at breakfast, and she would listen to my frustrations, offer perspective, and occasionally share stories from her own decades of legal work that reminded me I wasn't the first person to navigate a hostile probate battle, and I wouldn't be the last. She told me about a case she'd worked on in the 90s, representing a woman whose husband had left her his pension after 40 years of marriage, only to have his adult children from a previous marriage contest it. They put that woman through hell, Margaret said. Accused her of all kinds of things. She was younger than he was, so they claimed she'd seduced him for his money. Never mind that they'd been married for decades. Never mind that he'd explicitly stated his wishes in writing. They dragged it out for 2 years, and it nearly broke her. But she held on. She kept showing up. Not because she was rich or powerful or connected, but because she was telling the truth, and she refused to give up. "Will I win?" I asked Margaret one morning. She looked at me over her coffee cup, her eyes serious. "I can't tell you that for certain," she said. "But from everything you've told me, you have the stronger case. The will is clear. The medical evidence supports Thomas's competency. David's claims are thin. Unless there's something you haven't told me, something that could genuinely disqualify you, I think you're going to prevail. But you have to be prepared for it to get uglier before it gets better. Because desperate people do desperate things." She was right about that. The revelation came in March, and it changed everything. Lawrence called me on a Tuesday afternoon and asked if I could come to his office immediately. His tone was urgent but controlled, and I could hear something in his voice that I couldn't quite identify. Excitement, maybe, or vindication. I took a cab over, my stomach tight with anxiety. When I arrived, Lawrence and Rachel were both waiting in the conference room with a stack of documents spread across the table. There was also another man I didn't recognize, younger, maybe 40, with the intense focus of someone who spent their days staring at numbers. "We've discovered something," Lawrence said, without preamble, "about David Chen's finances. This is Marcus Webb, a forensic accountant we brought in to examine the company's financial records. Marcus, would you explain what you found?" Marcus Webb adjusted his glasses and began speaking in the precise, slightly clinical tone of someone explaining complex information to lay people. "Over the past 3 years, David Chen has systematically borrowed money from the company, using his position as Thomas's business partner and executor of certain corporate accounts. We're talking about substantial amounts, nearly $4 million total." I stared at him. My mind was trying to process the number. $4 million. Borrowed, I repeated. "Is that legal?" Lawrence's expression was grim. If it had been properly documented and approved through the corporate governance structure, yes. But it wasn't. David essentially wrote himself checks and disguised them as legitimate business expenses or short-term loans that were never repaid. Thomas either didn't notice or didn't confront him about it. We're not sure which. Marcus continued, walking me through the documentation. The withdrawals had started small, just $30,000 or $40,000 at a time, labeled as business loans or expense reimbursements. But over 3 years, they had escalated. By the final year of Thomas's life, David was taking out hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time, and the documentation had become increasingly sloppy. It was almost as if he'd stopped caring whether anyone noticed. Rachel leaned forward, her expression intense. "This is why David is fighting the will so hard. If you inherit the estate, you'll also inherit Thomas's stake in the company and all associated accounts, which means you'll have the authority to audit those accounts, and when you do, David's theft will be exposed. He's not fighting you because he thinks he deserves the money. He's fighting you because he's trying to avoid fraud charges." The weight of this information settled over me slowly. David wasn't just a grieving brother who felt he should have inherited. He was a thief protecting himself, and he had been willing to harass me, intimidate my family, surveil me, and drag Thomas's memory through the mud to keep his crimes hidden. I felt a coldness settle into my chest, the same coldness I had felt when Vincent handed me divorce papers. A clarity that comes from understanding exactly what kind of person you're dealing with. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "We present this evidence to Judge Okafor," Lawrence said. "We've already notified David's attorneys as required by discovery rules. They'll have a chance to respond, but I suspect this changes the entire landscape of the case. David may withdraw his contest entirely to avoid criminal prosecution." Instead, 3 days later, David filed an emergency motion claiming that Lawrence and I were fabricating evidence to undermine his credibility. That the financial irregularities were simple accounting errors that had been authorized by Thomas verbally, and that this was a desperate attempt to smear him because we knew our case was weak. It was a bold move, but a reckless one. Judge Okafor scheduled an evidentiary hearing for the following week, specifically to address David's alleged financial misconduct. I spent that week in a state of controlled tension. Margaret met me for breakfast every morning, providing steady companionship without demanding anything from me. She understood, I think, that I needed someone who would just be present without trying to fix everything or tell me it would be okay. Some mornings we barely talked. We just sat at the counter, drinking coffee, existing in the same space. It was exactly what I needed. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. That hearing was, in many ways, the turning point of the entire case. Lawrence brought in Marcus Webb, the forensic accountant, who walked through the documents methodically, showing the pattern of withdrawals, the lack of authorization, and the falsified records that David had used to cover his tracks. Marcus's testimony was devastating. Precise, unemotional, and utterly damning. He showed, withdrawal by withdrawal, how David had systematically stolen from the company, how the amounts had escalated over time, how the documentation had become increasingly fraudulent, how there was no possible way these transactions had been authorized by Thomas, because they violated every corporate governance policy the company had in place. David's attorneys tried to argue that Thomas had given verbal permission, but they couldn't produce a single witness or document to support that claim. Then Lawrence did something I hadn't expected. He entered into evidence emails between David and a woman named Lisa Hernandez, who had been Thomas's executive assistant for the last 10 years of his life. In those emails, sent 2 years before Thomas died, Lisa had explicitly questioned David about the unauthorized withdrawals and had warned him that she was obligated to report them to Thomas if they continued. David had responded by threatening to have her fired and implying that she was confused about the corporate structure and should mind her own business. Lisa, frightened of losing her job, had backed down, but she had kept copies of all the emails. She had stored them in a personal folder, just in case. And when Lawrence's team had contacted her during their investigation, she had provided everything. Lawrence had tracked Lisa down and convinced her to testify. She appeared at the hearing, a small woman in her 50s, with careful eyes and the nervous energy of someone who had spent years keeping a dangerous secret. She was nervous but resolute, and she confirmed everything. Thomas had not authorized those withdrawals. David had taken the money without permission and had threatened her when she tried to intervene. When Judge Okafor asked Lisa why she hadn't come forward sooner, Lisa's answer was simple and heartbreaking. I was scared, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I needed my job. I'm a single mother. I have 2 kids. David made it clear that if I said anything, I'd be fired. And I believed him. I knew he had that power, so I kept quiet. And I've regretted it every day since. Thomas was a good man. He deserved better than what David did to him. And I should have been braver. I should have told him. But I was scared, and I'm so sorry. Judge Okafor's expression remained neutral, but I could see something in her eyes. Anger, perhaps, or disgust. She thanked Lisa for her testimony and called a short recess. David Chen's case collapsed that day. Not immediately in the sense of a formal ruling, but in the sense that everyone in that courtroom, including his own attorneys, knew it was over. When we returned from recess, Harrison Steele stood and requested a private consultation with his client. They left the courtroom together, and we waited. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Finally they returned, and Steele approached the bench. His face was carefully neutral, but I could see the defeat in his eyes. Your Honor, he said, after consultation with my client, we are withdrawing our contest of the will. We will no longer be participating in these proceedings. Judge Okafor accepted the withdrawal with a single nod, then did something unexpected. She looked directly at David and said, Mr. Chen, I am referring this matter to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for potential criminal investigation. You are advised to retain separate legal counsel immediately. David went pale. For the first time since I'd seen him in that courtroom, his mask of confident hostility cracked. He looked smaller suddenly, afraid. He didn't look at me as he left the courtroom, but I watched him go, and I felt nothing. Not triumph, not vindication, just a tired sort of relief that it was finally ending. After the hearing, Lawrence, Rachel, and I went back to Lawrence's office. We sat in the conference room where we'd spent so many hours preparing, and Lawrence poured 3 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he kept in his desk. To justice, he said, raising his glass. And to Thomas, who clearly knew what kind of man his brother was, and made sure you'd be protected. We drank, and I felt the warmth of the whiskey spread through me, loosening something that had been tight in my chest for months. I asked. The contest is over, Lawrence said. David withdrew, but we still need to finalize the probate, get Judge Okafor's formal ruling, and then begin the actual distribution of the estate. That will take another few months. But yes, the hard part is over. You won. I went back to my hotel that evening and called my children, one by one. Michael, Rebecca, Jonathan. I told them what had happened. About David's theft. About his withdrawal. About the fact that we had won. They were elated, relieved, proud, but mostly they were just glad it was over. Glad I could stop fighting. Glad I could rest. That night I went to Murphy's Diner. Even though it was evening, and Margaret wouldn't be there, I sat at the counter and ordered coffee and pie, and I looked around at the ordinary people, living their ordinary lives, and I felt myself beginning to believe that I might get to have an ordinary life again, too. I would never be that woman again, the one who thought stability and security were guaranteed if you just worked hard enough, and loved enough, and sacrificed enough. But maybe I could be a different version of myself, one who knew how quickly everything could fall apart, but who also knew that she could survive it. The formal probate ruling came 6 weeks later, in mid-May. Judge Okafor found that Thomas Chen had been of sound mind and legal capacity when he executed his will, that I was positively identified as his lawful widow and intended beneficiary, and that the will's terms would be executed as written. The estate of Thomas Chen, valued at $63 million, was to be distributed to me, Eleanor Matthews, formerly Eleanor Chen, with the exception of the specified charitable bequests and the educational trust for David's grandchildren, which Thomas had established years before, and which would remain intact despite David's misconduct. I sat in that courtroom and listened to Judge Okafor read her ruling, and when it was done, I stood and shook Lawrence's hand and thanked Rachel, and then I walked out into the Chicago afternoon and stood on the courthouse steps and breathed. Just breathed. The sun was warm on my face. There was a light breeze coming off the lake. A woman at a bus stop across the street was arguing with someone on her phone. A man was selling flowers from a cart. Life was happening all around me, ordinary and ongoing, and I was part of it again. Not a woman in a shelter. Not a woman with nothing. Just a woman standing in the sun. The money was transferred into accounts established by Lawrence over the following month. $63 million is an abstraction until it becomes real numbers in real accounts that you can actually access. Lawrence walked me through the structure carefully. Some of it in liquid assets, some in property holdings, some in investments that required management. He recommended financial advisors, tax attorneys, all the infrastructure that sudden wealth requires. I listened and learned and made decisions carefully because I had been poor and I had been discarded, and I was never going to let myself be vulnerable like that again. The first thing I did, even before the money was fully transferred, was call my children, Michael, Rebecca, and Jonathan. I told them what had happened, what I had received, and what it meant for our family. I wanted them to hear it from me first, in my own words, before they heard rumors or speculation from anyone else. Michael cried. Actually cried on the phone, which he hadn't done since he was a boy. "Mom," he kept saying, his voice choked with emotion. "You're going to be okay. You're really going to be okay. I've been so scared for you. I didn't know what was going to happen. And now you're going to be okay." Rebecca was quieter, but I could hear the relief in her voice when she said, "I'm so proud of you, Mom, for fighting, for not giving up. So many women would have just accepted what happened, would have just stayed in the shelter and lived out their days there. You didn't let them erase you." Jonathan, my youngest, who lived in Seattle and worked as a software engineer and had always been the most pragmatic of my children, said, "So what are you going to do now? Where are you going to live? What's your plan?" And I realized I didn't have an answer. For the first time in my adult life, I could do anything, go anywhere, be anyone. The question was, what did I actually want? I stayed in Chicago. This surprised people, I think. My children assumed I would return to Massachusetts, maybe buy a house near one of them. But Chicago had become something unexpected over those months. It was the place where I had fought for myself, where I had met Margaret, who had become a genuine friend, where I could walk down Michigan Avenue or sit by the lake and feel anonymous and free in a way I hadn't felt in Massachusetts, where every face reminded me of something I had lost. A real one. A beautiful 3-bedroom condo in a building near Lincoln Park, with tall windows and hardwood floors and a view of the park's trees. The day I signed the purchase papers, I stood in the empty apartment and looked out those tall windows at the trees and the park and the city beyond, and I cried. Not from sadness, but from sheer disbelief that I was here, that I had survived, that I had gone from a cot in a shelter to this beautiful space that was mine, truly mine, in less than a year. I furnished it carefully, with pieces I chose because I loved them, not because they matched some idea of what a home should look like. For the first time in 76 years, I created a space that was entirely mine. I set up trust funds for my children and grandchildren, not excessive amounts, but enough to provide security and opportunity. I paid off Michael's mortgage, allowing him to finally breathe without the weight of that monthly payment. I funded Rebecca's daughter's college accounts, ensuring they wouldn't have to take out loans or work multiple jobs to get their educations. I made sure Jonathan had the capital to start the software company he had been talking about for years, but could never quite afford to launch. And then I started thinking about what I wanted to do with the rest of the money, the part that was truly extra, beyond what I needed to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I didn't need $63 million. I didn't even need half that. So what was I going to do with the rest? Margaret, during one of our breakfast conversations, suggested I talk to organizations that worked with displaced women and economic justice. "You've been where a lot of women end up," she said, her voice gentle but direct. "You know what it's like to have the system fail you. You know what it's like to be 71 years old with nowhere to go and no one to help you. Maybe you could do something about that. Maybe you could make it so other women don't have to go through what you went through." So I did. I reached out to the Elizabeth Stone house where I had stayed. I met with their director, a tired-looking woman named Sandra who clearly cared deeply about the work but was fighting an uphill battle with inadequate resources. I asked her what they needed, what would actually make a difference. She looked at me skeptically at first, probably used to people asking questions but never following through with help. But I pressed her. I want to help, I said. Really help. Not just write a small check and feel good about myself. I want to make an actual difference. So tell me, if money wasn't an issue, what would you do? Her skepticism melted, and she told me the truth. They needed everything. More beds, because they had to turn women away every single night. Better facilities that weren't falling apart. Funding for job training programs, so women could get skills that would lead to actual employment. Mental health services, because trauma doesn't just go away on its own. Childcare, so women could attend those job training programs and therapy sessions without having to choose between their own future and taking care of their kids. How much? I asked. How much would it take to do all of that? She did some quick calculations and then named a figure that seemed impossibly large to her, but was a tiny fraction of what I now had. I wrote her a check for $2 million. The director, Sandra, stared at it. Her hands were shaking as she held the check. She looked up at me, tears in her eyes. "Is this real?" she asked. I told her it was, and then she cried, and I cried, and we sat in her small, cluttered office and talked about all the women who would benefit from that money. Women who were where I had been just a year ago. It felt like the first genuinely good thing I had done with the inheritance. Not for myself or my family, but for strangers it deserved a chance. But I didn't stop there. I also established a foundation, with Margaret's help, focused on supporting older women who had been economically displaced by divorce or widowhood. We called it the Second Chances Foundation. Margaret agreed to serve on the board, bringing her decades of legal experience and her network of contacts in social services and legal aid. We brought in other women who had expertise in elder law, housing assistance, job training for older workers, and community organizing. The foundation funded legal aid services to help women navigate divorce proceedings and fight for fair settlements. We funded job retraining programs specifically designed for women over 50 who hadn't been in the workforce for years and needed skills that matched the current job market. We provided housing assistance, emergency grants for women who were on the verge of homelessness, and support groups where women could connect with others who understood what they were going through. Within a year, the foundation was operating in 3 states and helping hundreds of women. It wasn't enough to fix the systemic problems, the laws that left women vulnerable, the social structures that assumed women would always be taken care of by men, the economic realities that made it almost impossible for older women to recover from financial devastation. But it was something. It was my something, and every woman we helped felt like a small victory against the forces that had tried to erase me. David Chen's legal troubles unfolded separately from my life, though Lawrence kept me informed. The Cook County State's attorney did indeed investigate, and David was eventually charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The case took over a year to work its way through the system. David tried to fight the charges initially, but the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus Webb's forensic accounting was airtight. Lisa Hernandez's testimony was damning, and David's own attempts to cover up the theft had left a paper trail that prosecutors could easily follow. In the end, David pleaded guilty as part of a negotiated settlement. He received a suspended sentence, plus restitution and community service. He lost his business, his reputation, and most of his assets. The restitution order meant he had to pay back the $4 million he'd stolen, plus interest and penalties. It effectively wiped him out financially. I didn't follow the case closely. Once the probate was settled, David ceased to be relevant to my life. He had tried to hurt me and failed. That was enough. Vincent, my ex-husband, reached out exactly once. A letter arrived at my Chicago address about 8 months after the probate ruling. He had somehow obtained my address, probably through mutual acquaintances in Massachusetts who had heard about my inheritance and couldn't resist gossiping about it. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten, full of apologies and regret and careful explanations about how the divorce had been a mistake, how he had been under stress, how the business failures had affected his judgment. He said he had never stopped caring about me, that Gina had been a mistake, a momentary lapse during a difficult time, that he wanted to meet, to talk about the possibility of reconciliation. He suggested we could start over, maybe travel together, enjoy the financial security that I now had. He never explicitly mentioned the money, but the timing made his motivations transparent. The letter was dated just 2 weeks after a local newspaper had run a story about a Massachusetts woman inheriting a fortune from her first husband who had supposedly died decades ago. I read the letter once, then set it aside. A week later, I drafted a response. 3 sentences. Vincent, I received your letter. I have moved on with my life, and have no interest in revisiting the past. I wish you well. I signed it Eleanor Matthews, not Eleanor Whitmore, because I had legally reverted to my maiden name after the probate settled. I wanted no connection to Vincent's name or Vincent's life. I mailed the letter and never heard from him again. Margaret asked me once, over breakfast on a morning when the diner was nearly empty and snow was falling outside, if I had forgiven Thomas for letting me believe he was dead. It was a question I had been avoiding, even in my own mind. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I'm not sure forgiveness is the right word, I finally said. He didn't choose to fake his death. He didn't choose to disappear. He was told I had been notified. He was told there had been a funeral. And yes, maybe he could have tried harder to find me later, but he did try. And eventually, he gave up because he believed I had moved on and was happy. How do I hold that against him? He thought he was doing the right thing by leaving me alone, by not disrupting the life he thought I'd built. Margaret nodded slowly, considering. You know what I think, she said. I think what Thomas gave you at the end wasn't just money. It was proof that you had been loved, that someone had remembered you and valued you, even when you were at your most forgotten. Even when you were living in a shelter and the world was treating you like you were disposable. Somewhere there was a record of your worth. A will that said you mattered, a fortune that said you had been valued. That's not nothing. That might actually be everything. She was right, of course. The money had given me security and options, and the ability to help others. But the knowledge that Thomas had carried me in his memory for 43 years, that I had mattered to him in a way that transcended time and distance and all the ordinary forgetting that happens in life, that was the real gift. It didn't undo the years I had spent with Vincent, believing I was building a partnership, when I was actually building nothing. It didn't erase the humiliation of the divorce, or the nights on that shelter cot. But it gave me a different story to tell, about who I was, and who I had been to someone. It proved that I had been worthy of love. Real love. The kind that doesn't fade, or give up, or calculate costs. And that proof, in the darkest moments of my life, had been the lifeline I didn't know I needed. If you feel my words, if my story has touched something in you, I ask you to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community, so we can bring more truthful stories for you. Stories of women who refuse to disappear. Stories of survival and dignity and the stubborn insistence that we matter, no matter what anyone else says. It's been 5 years now since Rachel Portman walked into the Elizabeth Stone house and turned my life into something I wouldn't have imagined possible. I'm 76 years old. I live in a beautiful apartment overlooking Lincoln Park. I have financial security that extends to my children and grandchildren. I have work that matters through the foundation. I have a friend in Margaret who meets me for breakfast and tells me when I'm being stubborn or impractical, and who makes me laugh on days when I don't feel like laughing. I have a life that is astonishingly mine. Last month, I visited the cemetery where Thomas is buried. It's in a quiet area north of Chicago, surrounded by old oak trees that must be over 100 years old. The cemetery is beautiful in the way old cemeteries are, peaceful and somehow comforting rather than sad. I brought flowers, wildflowers like the ones that grow near my building in the summer, because that's what Thomas used to bring me when we were young and broke and wildly in love. Roadside wildflowers he'd pick on his way home from work, because he couldn't afford a florist, but wanted to bring me something beautiful anyway. I stood at his grave for a long time, just looking at the headstone. Thomas James Chen, 1949 to 2021. Beloved brother, friend, and builder of better things. The inscription was simple, chosen by David, before he knew Thomas had left everything to me. I wondered if David regretted those words now. If he wished he could chisel them off and replace them with something bitter and accusatory. I didn't cry. I had done all my crying years ago, both when I thought Thomas had died the first time and during those early days after learning the truth. Instead, I just talked to him quietly, the way you might talk to someone who isn't there, but who you hope somehow still hears. I told him about Michael and Rebecca and Jonathan, about the grandchildren he never met, about how Michael had become a teacher, following a passion he'd discovered late in life, about how Rebecca's daughters were both in college now, studying engineering and medicine, about how Jonathan's company was thriving. I told him about the foundation and the women we were helping, about the Elizabeth Stone House and the new wing they were building with my donation, which they'd named after me despite my protests, about my apartment and my life and the fact that I was, finally, after everything, okay. More than okay. I was content, at peace, living a life that felt authentic and meaningful in a way my life with Vincent never had. I told him thank you for remembering me, for the letters he wrote me when we were young, which I still kept in that cedar box, for the will that saved me when I had nothing left, for proving to me that I had been worth loving, even if that love had been cut short by circumstances neither of us could control. And I told him I hoped he had found some peace in those 43 years between when he lost me and when he died, because God knows he deserved some peace after everything. The sun was setting when I left the cemetery, turning the sky orange and pink, in that particular way Chicago evenings do in autumn. The air was cooling, and I pulled my coat tighter as I walked back to my car. I drove back to my apartment, and Margaret was waiting in the lobby with Hamilton the Basset Hound, and we went for a walk through the park, like we did most evenings, when the weather allowed. Hamilton moved slowly, the way very old dogs do, taking his time to smell everything, and periodically stopping to rest his ancient bones. Margaret and I walked beside him, matching our pace to his, talking about nothing in particular. She told me about a book she was reading. I told her about a documentary I'd watched. We discussed the Foundation's upcoming fundraiser, and whether we should try to expand into a fourth state next year. Ordinary conversation about ordinary things. And I thought about how strange it was that life can take everything from you, reduce you to nothing, make you believe you have no value. And then just when you've accepted that this is how the story ends, it can turn around completely. Not because you were rescued, not because someone took pity on you, but because you refused to disappear. Because you stood up in a courtroom and said, I am still here, and I still matter, and you cannot erase me. Because when someone offered you a chance to fight for yourself, you said yes, even though you were exhausted, even though you were scared, even though every rational part of your brain said it was too much, too complicated, too risky. You said yes anyway. That's what I want women to understand, especially women my age or approaching my age, who have given decades to marriages and families and homes and suddenly find themselves discarded or forgotten or invisible. You are not invisible. You still matter. Your life is not over because someone decided it was. And sometimes, in ways you cannot predict or control, the universe will hand you an opportunity to reclaim yourself. And when it does, you take it. You fight for it. You don't apologize. You don't shrink. You stand there in your truth and you take what is rightfully yours. The money helped, of course. I won't pretend it didn't. $63 million is transformative in ways both practical and psychological. It's the difference between eating ramen noodles every day and being able to choose what you eat. It's the difference between worrying about every dollar and being able to be generous. It's the difference between feeling worthless and feeling valued. But what mattered more was the choice I made in that shelter lobby when Rachel Portman told me about the estate and the conditions and the fight it would require. I could have said no. I could have decided it was too complicated, too exhausting, too much for a woman my age. I could have told myself I had already lost too much and couldn't risk losing again. I could have let fear or shame or exhaustion convince me to walk away. But I didn't. I said yes. I said I'll do it. And that decision, that moment, was when my life actually changed. The money followed, but the change happened first, internally, when I decided I was worth fighting for. I sit in my apartment now, on quiet Saturday mornings, drinking coffee and watching the light come through my windows, and I think about all the women who are where I was, in shelters, in failing marriages, in situations where they have been made to feel they have no value. And I want to reach through time and space and tell them what I learned. You do have value. You always did. It was never about whether you deserved dignity and security and love. You always deserved those things. The only question was whether the people around you recognized it, and if they didn't, that was their failure, not yours. My daughter Rebecca is visiting next week. She's bringing her daughters, my granddaughters, both in college now, and full of plans and ambitions, and the kind of confidence I never had at their age. The kind of confidence that comes from growing up in a world that, while still far from perfect, at least tells women they can have ambitions beyond marriage and motherhood. I'm taking them shopping, and then we're having dinner at a restaurant I love that overlooks the lake. A place where they make this incredible paella, and the wine list is extensive, and you can watch the boats on the water while you eat. I'm going to tell them my whole story, not the sanitized version, but the real one. About Thomas and Vincent and the shelter and the probate fight and how close I came to giving up. I want them to know that strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you discover when you have no other choice. And I want them to know that it's never too late. Never. At 71, living in a shelter with $400 and a garbage bag as belongings, I still have the capacity to transform my life. If I could do it then, they can do it now. We all can. There are days, I won't lie, when I still feel the weight of those lost years. When I think about what my life might have been if Thomas had lived, if the hospital hadn't made that terrible mistake, if we had raised Michael together and grown old together and built something real. But I can't live in that alternate reality. None of us can. We only get the one life we actually have, with all its accidents and injustices and impossible turns. What we do with that life, how we respond when it breaks us, that's the only thing we truly control. I chose to fight. I chose to stand in that courtroom and say Thomas Chen was my husband, and he remembered me, and I deserve what he left for me. I chose to refuse David Chen's bullying and Vincent's manipulations, and the voice in my own head that sometimes whispered I was too old, too broken, too irrelevant to matter anymore. And because I made that choice, I got to have these 5 years. This apartment. This friendship with Margaret. This foundation that helps women who need what I needed. This life that feels, finally, like it belongs to me. So yes, I inherited $63 million from a man who died 43 years after I thought he died the first time. Yes, that money changed everything in practical terms. But the real inheritance wasn't the money. It was the message. The message that said you mattered then, and you matter now, and you will always matter, regardless of what anyone else believes. That was what Thomas gave me in the end. Not wealth, not security, but proof that I had been loved and remembered and valued, even when I couldn't see it myself. I am 76 years old. I have lived long enough to be abandoned twice, to be homeless, to be written off as irrelevant by people who should have known better. Not through bitterness or revenge, but simply by continuing to exist, by refusing to accept the narrative that said my story was over. It wasn't over. It was just entering a new chapter. And that chapter has been, against all odds, beautiful. This is Eleanor Matthews, formerly Eleanor Chen, formerly Eleanor Collins, formerly a woman in a shelter with nothing but a box of old photographs and a pressed wildflower. And I am here to tell you that it is never ever too late to reclaim your life. Never too late to fight for what you deserve. Never too late to discover that you are worth infinitely more than anyone ever told you. The world will try to convince you otherwise, especially if you are a woman, especially if you are older, especially if you have already been discarded once. But the world is wrong. You are not disposable. You are not invisible. You are not finished. I wasn't finished. Remember that. Hold on to it. And when your moment comes, when your Rachel Portman walks through the door with news that seems impossible, when your chance arrives to change everything, take it. Fight for it. Stand in your truth and refuse to be moved. Because you deserve it. You always did. And no one, no matter who they are or what power they think they have over you, can take that away unless you let them. Don't let them. Don't ever let them. Stand up. Fight back. Reclaim yourself. And when you do, when you're standing in your own home that you chose for yourself, drinking coffee in the morning light, and realizing that somehow, impossibly, you made it through, you'll understand what I understand now. The inheritance wasn't the money. The inheritance was the truth that you always mattered, even when you couldn't see it. Even when no one else could see it. You will always matter. That is how a woman of 71, left with nothing but a suitcase and an old tin box, ended up with everything that actually mattered. Dignity cannot be given to you by others, and it cannot be taken away by them either. Vincent could laugh. David could scheme. The world could put me in a room with a rattling heater and a thin mattress and tell me I was worthless. None of it touched what I actually was, because what I actually was, what I am, what every woman is someone who matters, someone who has value, someone who deserves better. And once you truly understand that, once it becomes not just something you know intellectually, but something you feel in your bones, no one can take it from you ever again. It is never too late to refuse the terms someone else has set for your life. It is never too late to stand up and say, no, actually, I deserve better than this. It is never too late to fight for yourself. I did it at 71. I did it when I had nothing. I did it when every rational voice said I should just accept my fate and be grateful for whatever scraps I was given. And I won, not because I was special or particularly strong or blessed by fate, but because I decided I mattered. And then I acted like I mattered. And eventually, the world had no choice but to agree. What would you have done in that motel lobby? What would you do if a lawyer walked up to you right now and told you your entire life was about to change? Would you say yes? Would you fight? Would you believe even for a moment that you deserved something better? Leave a comment. I'd truly like to know. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about your own worth or your own capacity to survive and transform, please subscribe. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for letting me tell you about Thomas and Vincent and David and Rachel and Margaret and all the people who shaped this strange, difficult, ultimately redemptive journey. I hope my voice reaches you wherever you are. I hope my story reminds you that you are not alone, that other women have walked this path, that we have survived, that we have more than survived, we have thrived, and if we can do it, so can you. Subscribe to this channel, be part of this community, tell me where you're listening from. Let's build something together. All of us women who refuse to be erased, who know our worth, who understand that our stories matter, because they do, we do, and we always will. This is Eleanor Matthews, signing off with hope, with gratitude, and with the firm conviction that it is never too late to write a new ending to your story. Never too late to fight for yourself. Never too late to win. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for believing, even if only for the duration of this story, that women like me, women like you, women who have been dismissed and discarded and told we don't matter, thank you for believing that we do matter. Because we do. We always did. And we always will. And remember, no matter where you are in your life right now, no matter how dark things seem, no matter how many times you've been told you're too old, too poor, too broken, too late, it's not true. You still have value, you still have worth, and you still have the capacity to transform your life if you're willing to fight for it. I'm living proof of that. And I hope, in some small way, my story helps you believe it too. Thank you, and remember, you matter. Always.